You're listening to Release Your Resistance with Bex Beltran, episode 93. Welcome to Release Your Resistance. This is Bex. The only reason why any of us don't have what we want in life is because of our own resistance. Right now, I'm learning how to recognize and release my resistance, and this podcast tells you how you can release your resistance so that you can live the exact life that you want. Let's get started. What topic do you love talking about with other people? Do you ever wish that you had other people to talk to about your favorite topics or things that you find interesting? Today's episode might be just what you need. It's about how you can start a Podclub. First of all, what is a Podclub? It's like a book club, but instead of reading an entire book and then coming together to discuss, you only listen to one episode of a podcast and then get together to talk about it. You might have heard me talking about Podclub on previous episodes. For example, I brought it up when I told you about bright ideas and brainstorms, or maybe I've invited you to join me for Podclub, or maybe you've seen me mention it on my website or on social media. I've been doing my Podclub since the spring of 2020, and it is something that I look forward to every month. I've gotten so many benefits from hosting it. I've met some really interesting people, learned about new-to-me topics, and listened to so many new-to-me podcasts that I might not have heard otherwise. If you are interested in a Podclub or any other type of club or event, you could start one of your own. It's so interesting to me that at the same time that I decided to share my blueprint of how you can start a podcast, I encountered two similar examples or representations of groups that are kind of like Podclub. The first example is on the television show Only Murders in the Building. Have you heard about this show? It's on Hulu, and it stars Martin Short, Steve Martin, and Selena Gomez. And their three characters live in a beautiful historical apartment building in New York City. And they get into all sorts of capers and shenanigans and plots and schemes. And the way that these three characters came together, aside from living in the same apartment building, is that they discovered they were all fans of the same true crime podcast, narrated, by the way, by a Tina Fey character, but that's beside the point. So the three of them ended up listening to it and discussing the podcast together, and then they decided to start their own podcast. And then fast forward a few episodes into the series, once they do have their own podcast up and running, a few of their podcast fans end up sitting outside of their building waiting to see them and hoping to get to talk to them. It was funny when I was thinking about today's episode, I realized that group of fans is kind of like a Podclub. Not exactly like the Podclub that I run, but they all share a love of this specific fictional podcast, and they get together to discuss it and even took a field trip together to see if they could meet some of the creators of the podcast. And that is when I realized, oh, the entire television show is basically based on another type of Podclub, because the way that the main characters came together was also due to their love of a certain podcast. The second example that came earlier this week was when I was scrolling through social media and someone mentioned on a comment that one thing that she was looking forward to this week was going to her podcast group. And someone else commented asking, what is a podcast group? And she described that she was in a local group of friends who all love listening to the same podcast, so they get together to discuss that podcast, which is exactly what I just described in the fictional example of the TV show. I think it's so fun that all of these examples are popping up for me lately. And one thing that it goes to show is how popular podcasts are and how they are making their way into mainstream entertainment and social media. In fact, they have been for many, many years. And this realization made me back up a little bit and think about when I first started listening to podcasts. One of the first podcasts that I binged was a very popular podcast that many people started as their first podcast to listen to. It was called Serial. That's Serial, not the breakfast food. So it's like a series. Every new week, each new episode continued the coverage about the same topic. The topic in season 1 of Serial was a murder and court case that happened in the late 90s in Baltimore, Maryland. The interest in the case was revived 15 years later when a friend of the accused and incarcerated central character asked a reporter to look into the case and the court proceedings to see if there was anything that could be done. And I remember listening to that series with so much attention and so much curiosity and fascination. I don't think I wondered at that time if other people were listening to the podcast that I could discuss the unfoldings with, but I was hooked. And if I did happen to meet someone who listened to it or who knew about it, I definitely wanted to hear their theories and their takeaways from their listening experience. A few years later, I really got the desire and wish that I had someone to discuss the case with when I started listening to a second podcast that was inspired because of the Serial podcast season 1. The second podcast was called Undisclosed. And I got so caught up in that second podcast. And I even remember posting on social media at the time, is anyone listening to Undisclosed right now? I really need to talk to someone about this. In those early podcast listening years for me, before I ever decided to start Podclub, I had the early desire for people to talk to about what we were all listening to. Flash forward to today. Now I have an established pod club that meets that wish that I had all those years ago. But we don't listen to crime podcasts, but I guess we could, or better yet, you could, if that's what you're interested in. The podcast episodes that I select for Podclub that I lead are not about true crime. They are not about murder. They're not about court cases. The Podclub that I host is more about personal and self-development. But you can make a Podclub about any topic that you want. In my Podclub, we listen to a different episode of a different podcast every month. And I don't think we've ever repeated a podcast, so we have now listen to episodes from at least 18 or maybe even 20 different podcasts. Now, you might be wondering, why are you even talking about this? Why should I hear about how to start a pod club? I think there are so many benefits that you might enjoy. If this strikes your interest at all, it is pretty low effort and low commitment. Those are the costs. And the benefits of meeting like-minded people, getting an expanded understanding or perspective of what you're listening to, getting a little bit of accountability, being exposed to new podcasts and new episodes and teachers that you otherwise might not have heard, all of those rewards make having or being a member of a pod club totally worth it. Being in a pod club creates the time commitment for something that you otherwise might not make time for. There are just so many benefits, and that's the reason why I definitely plan to continue running Podclub for as long as people continue to show up for it. I'm going to share my own personal experience of creating and running this Podclub for about 1.5 years now, and then you can take my experience and add to it or substitute or modify so that it matches what you want for yourself. When I thought about the most basic way to explain how to start a pod club, I thought of 4 basic steps. Decide to do it, figure out how and where to meet, choose the episodes, then show up and discuss. My experience was that I decided to do it and then I just did it. I think the original idea for this Podclub stemmed from a brainstorming activity that I did at the beginning of 2020 when I was trying to figure out how I could meet people and connect with people even though most of the world was staying home. I came up with a lot of different topics of online meetups that people might want to attend that I could host and that I would personally want to attend. And Podclub was one of the ideas that came up. So maybe because of hearing me talk about it today, or maybe because you have been thinking of doing something like this for a while, you could just decide to do it and put it out there. And there are a lot of different places that you could, quote unquote, put it out there. There are no rules or requirements or right ways to do this. There's no minimum or maximum number of people. You and one other friend could just decide to start a Podclub together. Or you could put your new idea on Meetup. That's what I did. You could put it in a Facebook group. Create a Facebook group. More people are probably accustomed to using Facebook, and you could use the group invite feature to invite all the people that you know. And the Podclub that I host is monthly. We meet on the first Thursday of every month, so you could host yours routinely like I do, or you could do it periodically or sporadically. For example, just whenever you hear an episode or whenever you come across a topic that you want to discuss with other people. The whole purpose of me starting this Podclub in early 2020 was a way to meet and get to know people online because of the physical restrictions at the time. And that is the reason that my Podclub is on Zoom. And that's definitely an option for you if you choose it. But there are so many other options too, depending on where you live and who you know and who you invite. It might be nice to meet at a library or in a park or at a restaurant or a coffee shop or even someone's home. It just depends on what you want and how you want to meet people and what you feel comfortable with. I really like the idea of using Zoom, and I will continue to use it for my Podclub because of the accessibility. Using Zoom means that we are not denying anyone the ability to join based on distance or geography or ability to get to a location. Really, the only thing that's required is an internet connection. And we welcome people with cameras and microphones on or off. And we have had people join with their phones. That's an option. You don't even have to be at a computer or have good lighting or a pretty background. And step 2 is to find your episodes. So the way that I find my episodes for Podclub is, first of all, I think about what I want to learn more about. I consider what I'm interested in exploring, or I think about the people who I'm interested in hearing from. Our very first episode last year was from Brene Brown's podcast. I had recently learned that she had started a podcast, so I thought it would be interesting to listen to it and discuss it with other people who are Brene Brown fans, as well as people who have never heard of her before. Another teacher that I love is Martha Beck, and when I realized that she had a podcast, I decided to use one of her early episodes as an episode for our Podclub too. In other cases, there have been authors that I really appreciate. For example, the author of the book Emotional Agility by Dr. Susan David. I'm always impressed when I hear her speak, and I wanted to devote a Podclub meeting to her work. So I did a Google search for her name with the word podcast, and I found a few different options. And during one Podclub meeting, we had someone who suggested that we have a Podclub discussion about money blocks. So I spent some time Googling and previewing episodes talking about money blocks. I have a few criteria that I use when selecting an episode that we'll discuss. My criteria are that the episode should be an hour or under, with not too many ads or commercials, and not too much pre-topic chit-chat where the hosts go off on tangents, or if they talk about things that a newcomer to the podcast doesn't know about. And I am very choosy about good sound quality because I know that we are all going to be listening at different times, doing different things on different devices, and I don't want listening to be a strain for anyone. So if the sound quality is just too annoying to listen to, even if it's good content, I usually won't choose that episode. I will preview a few different episodes and then decide on one that I think everyone would benefit from hearing or discussing and that would make a good discussion. And then I promote it. I link the episode on Meetup. I put it on my Facebook group. I put it as a link on my website. I mentioned the Podclub topic to people as I run into them or as we talk. And then on the first Thursday of every month, we all show up on Zoom. I usually have some questions prepared, which is part of the fourth step. Prior to our meeting, I listen to the episode twice. The first time is when I'm choosing it, and then again the day of or the day before the Podclub meeting, and I re-listen to it and I try to come up with a few discussion questions about the episode. And this is just in case we run into a stall in our conversation. I have some questions or specific concepts or verbiage from the episode to keep the conversation going. And sometimes we use the questions, but most of the time we don't even need to. A regular Podclub for us is when we all get together on Zoom at 5 p.m. Arizona time on the first Thursday of every month, and we have a few minutes of chit-chat. If anyone is new and joining us for the first time, we do introductions so that we all know who we are and where we are in the world, because yes, we do have people joining us from different countries, and then we just dive right into the discussion. We talk about what we liked about the episode, we bring up what we learned, sometimes we also mention what we didn't like or what we were confused by. And frequently there will be some concept or topic that was new to someone, so then we can give our own definition or description of what that new concept meant to us. And some of us might even jump on Google during the discussion to look up the definition of something or get further information about a topic that we're discussing, which is another benefit of doing it on our computers versus doing it in person. Although that would be an option too if you're meeting in person, since most of us have Google on our phones. We will sometimes share links about the topic or other episodes or other resources in the chat box, and sometimes our discussion will go off on a tangent. The conversation can go way off, and we might end up talking about other things that are not really related to the episode anymore, which that's fine too. And then at the very end, right around the end of the hour, we'll just confirm when our next meeting is, and we'll talk about what kind of episode we might want to listen to for the next meeting. Sometimes we get suggestions, sometimes we don't. It's always a lovely conversation, and I always leave having learned something new or having heard a new perspective. So that's it. That is my experience of starting and hosting a Podclub. Those are my 4 steps or loose suggestions and personal explanation of how you could start your own or something like it. If you're curious about starting any kind of a meetup, a club, or a discussion group, I think you should just decide on your own purpose and intention for doing it. And then think about what you want to get out of it. Consider if you want a theme. So my podcast theme is mostly about personal and self-development. Maybe your Podclub's theme could be about personal development, or maybe it could be about fiction or comedy podcasts, or you might be interested in discussing true crime shows, or you could focus your Podclub on episodes all about your favorite reality TV shows. Maybe you won't create a Podclub at all. What if you created a docu-club where everyone watches the same documentary and then comes together to discuss? There are so many options. If you wanted to start a Podclub or a YouTube discussion group with business owners, you could listen to or watch all business-related episodes. If you wanted to start a discussion group with other real estate investors, you could listen to real estate and investing advice or money management podcasts. There are so many directions that you could go with this. If you do decide that starting a Podclub is just not for you, but just hearing how this all rolled out for me and how it's become a monthly occurrence for me, hopefully it has inspired you. You might want to start a different kind of club. It doesn't have to have anything to do with podcasts. Or if you're intrigued by this but don't want to go through the effort of starting your own, you are definitely welcome to join my Podclub. We will be meeting again on the first Thursday of November at 5 p.m. Arizona time on Zoom. You can check the show notes for this episode at bexb.org/podclub to find the link to the episode that we'll be listening to, as well as the Zoom link so that you can join us. I also usually update the bexb.org/letsmeet, that's LETSMEET, page up to date with all of my upcoming meetings and events. For example, I also host a monthly in-person journaling and friendship group to provide some light encouragement and accountability for journaling. And one last thing before we end today, let's do a resistance check. Did you have any resistance to thinking of starting a monthly meeting, discussion group, or club? Any resistance to looking for and listening to new podcast episodes for every month and then discussing it with other people? Are you like me and have some inexplicable resistance to reading when it's quote-unquote expected for a book club, but you love to read in general? What other thoughts or ideas came up for you as you listened to my explanation of how to start a pod club? Share your comments with me at bexb.org/podclub or send me an email at hi@bexb.org. And I cannot wait to hear what you thought about all of this or hear your thoughts and suggestions in our next pod club discussion. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk with you next week. This has been Release Your Resistance. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, make sure you're subscribed and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Also, think about someone who you know who would love this episode and share it with them. There should be a share button on your app if you're listening to this on your phone. If you'd like to continue this conversation one-on-one or in real time, come visit me on my site at bexb.org to see how we can work together.